On the fateful night of July 8, 2014, Brazil lined up against Germany in the semifinals of the 2014 World Cup, which was being hosted in Brazil. What occurred in the match was no doubt the most shocking result in World Cup history, and probably in all of football, as Brazil was utterly torn to shreds, 7-1 by the Germans. The game was so devastating that it now has its own name, being referred to as the Miraço by Brazilians. If you follow football, you know how it went down. Brazil came into the match off their enigmatic victory over a high-energy Colombia, but were now left without Neymar and Thiago Silva. Germany arrived after expertly sending France home in the quarterfinals. While most were expecting a tight game, Thomas Müller opened the score in the 11th minute after terrible marking during a corner. Absolutely atrocious defending from the Brazilians continued as Miroslav Klose slided home Germany's second, breaking Ronaldo de Lima's record for most World Cup goals in history. From there on, the match descended into chaos as Germany scored a total of 4 goals within the next 6 minutes, with 2 goals from Toni Kroos and 1 from Sami Khedira, adding to Klose's goal. Brazil ended the first half 5-0 down, and while they tried to mount a comeback in the second, their efforts proved futile after Andrei Sherlov came off the bench and scored 2 in the final 20 minutes. Oscar was able to score a consolation goal for Brazil in the final moments, but the damage had already been done, obviously. The match ended in a 7-1 defeat for Brazil, their worst ever defeat in a World Cup, their first defeat on home soil since 1975, and a result that equaled their previous record for heaviest defeat, a 6-0 loss at the hands of Uruguay in 1920. This was also the worst defeat of any team in the semifinals of the World Cup, and the worst defeat suffered by the host nation. To add insult to injury, the aforementioned German striker Miroslav Klose eclipsed Ronaldo de Lima, Brazil's best ever number 9, for most goals in World Cup history. But let's not forget who Brazil are. They are no doubt the most successful national team in football history. They have won more trophies than any other country, including 5 World Cups, a record high. This is the nation of legends like Pelé, Garrincha, Ronaldo, the same land where football is part of national pride in everyday life. So what was wrong with Brazil? How exactly did the best footballing country in the world concede 7 goals in a World Cup semifinal in their own backyard? Well, the simple answer is that Brazil was missing both Neymar Jr. and Thiago Silva for the semifinal matchup with Germany. Neymar was absent through injury after he sustained a fractured vertebrae when the Colombian defender Juan Zuniga kneed him in the back during their quarterfinal matchup. Thiago Silva had received a rather idiotic yellow card in that same match after he carelessly fouled Colombia's goalkeeper, David Ospina, and yellow card accumulation meant he would miss the semifinals. The absence of these 2 players both metaphorically represents a larger issue within themselves, but together they also represent underlying problems with this team, which came to a climax in epic fashion during the match against Germany. The injury to Neymar was definitely the more high profile of the 2 missing players. He was the star of this Brazilian team and the star of the whole World Cup. His awe-inspiring performances throughout the tournament meant that any chance of Brazil winning the World Cup rested on his shoulders. If one were to look at the statistics, it would only confirm Neymar's importance. In the 5 matches he played, he scored 4 goals and had 2 assists. Brazil scored a total of 11 goals at the 2014 World Cup, meaning that Neymar directly contributed to 6 out of the 11, or 54%. A much higher percentage than any other player in the squad. He also received 2 Man of the Match awards. Beyond the stats, Neymar's role in this team was vital to Brazil's success from a moral point of view. If one were to watch this team play, it would see that every attack is either started by Neymar or involves him somehow. The rest of the team seemed to just pass Neymar the ball and expect him to do something. This is partly because of how great of a player Neymar is, but at the same time, it also shows how much of the rest of Brazil's attack underperformed. At the 2014 World Cup, Hulk had great runs and got into good positions, but his decisions in the final third were atrocious. Fred was probably the most heavily criticized player on the pitch versus Germany, and had arguably the worst performance of any player throughout the entire tournament. Willian barely got to play, but when he did not necessarily impress. Like Willian, Joe did not play much, but he was even worse in the few moments he had on the pitch. And finally, Bernard, the player who was tasked to fill Neymar's spot, looked like a lost child out on the field and failed to replicate any of Neymar's influence on the team. In fact, the only attacker besides Neymar who had a decent tournament was Oscar. Without Neymar, Brazil had major problems up top. Not only was their top goal scorer and creator gone, but they did not have anyone able to replace him. The moral damage of not having Neymar was devastating. Even with everyone in top form, Neymar was still the linchpin. A player of his caliber forces the opposing team to dedicate an extra defender to cover him, restricting freedom of the overall team. He was the player that would induce fear in all the teams they faced. He was also the player whose face was on all the television commercials, billboards, and magazines across the country. The same player whose name was on the shirts of all the children up in the stands. Losing Neymar Jr. was the worst possible thing that could happen with this fragile Brazilian team. And it happened. While Thiago Silva's yellow card suspension did not generate as much media attention as Neymar's injury, it should in no way diminish how harmful his absence was. Besides Neymar, Silva was no doubt Brazil's next best player. To put it metaphorically, Thiago Silva was the glue that desperately held together Brazil's already shaky defense. He was also the captain of this team and one of the most experienced players. While many criticized and continue to criticize his leadership qualities, and rightfully so, as he can be too emotional and anxious at times, Thiago Silva was arguably the best suited player in the squad to be captain. Certainly better than David Luiz, who captained Brazil in Silva's absence. On the pitch, Silva was easily Brazil's best defender in terms of his anticipation of play, composure, ability in the air, and eye for tackles. But his influence is more than that, as he is often seen screaming at his teammates, motivating them, telling them where they should be, or what they need to do. Without him, the whole team, but especially the defense, was completely disorganized, a weakness that Germany heavily exploited. Much like Neymar in the attack, Thiago Silva was the only defender in Brazil's squad who played well for the most part. Dani Alves and Marcelo were good going forward, but their positioning was appalling, leaving major gaps behind them, while Maxwell and Maicon looked slow and cumbersome. David Luiz had some truly great moments at this tournament, but at the same time, he had some truly terrible ones as well. David Luiz, by nature, is an ambitious and extravagant player. However, his boldness can sometimes be a liability. That's why when David Luiz is paired with a more conservative and calculated center back like Thiago Silva, who can cover for him, Luiz's great abilities can be seen on full display. Thiago Silva's replacement for the game against Germany, Dante, was the complete opposite of what a player like David Luiz needed. In 2014, Dante was by no means a bad defender, but he also wasn't Thiago Silva, and at times it seemed that Dante and David Luiz were having a competition to see whose decision-making can be more rash. Lacking players of both Neymar and Thiago Silva's quality would be a great loss for any team, but the fact that Brazil, a nation who is known for being a conveyor belt of world-class talent, couldn't offer proper replacements for these two players highlights a much deeper problem that existed for Brazil in 2014. And that is that this generation of footballers was simply not good enough. It is unfortunate, but these things happen in football. National teams have certain generations blessed with talent and others that are not. The generation of Brazilian footballers from 1999 to 2007 and even the generation from 1994 to 1998 made up some of the best teams of all time. In that period, Brazil won 2 World Cups and 4 Copa Americas, among many other trophies. A dip in quality was inevitable, but unfortunately for Brazil, it came at the worst possible time, when they were hosting the World Cup. The squads at both the 2010 and 2014 World Cup were evidence of this. While they were not bad squads by any means in terms of player quality, they were subpar by Brazil's high standards. The only reason that Brazil was favored to win the 2014 World Cup was because they were the host. But for a footballing powerhouse like Brazil, these generational problems usually resolve themselves over time, and from 2017 to the present day, Brazil have an extremely talented squad and arguably the best team in the world again. Even still, you could take a good but not great squad and achieve success. All it takes is the right manager and an intelligent plan in place. Again, unfortunately for Brazil, they lacked that in 2014. For years, Brazil struggled to find a right manager that fit the team. And with the World Cup coming up soon, they panicked and hired Luis Felipe Scolari, who is commonly known as Filipao. The only reason they gave him the job was because he won the World Cup with Brazil back in 2002. However, the team in 2014 was vastly different than the one back in 2002, and Scolari himself was a different man as well. Throughout his second tenure, he made several big mistakes, which ultimately led to Brazil's demise. The first major mistake he made was his squad selection. As was mentioned before, Brazil was not experiencing a golden generation or anything, but still, Scolari made the problem worse with the players he chose to bring to the World Cup. After Brazil emphatically won the 2013 Confederations Cup, also on home soil, Scolari stubbornly stuck with the same starting 11, despite the fact that some of the players were in poor form. Paulinho had a mediocre season with Tottenham, and Julio Cesar was now playing in MLS, yet they still retained their starting spot, for example. The Confederations Cup is a very different tournament from the World Cup, so Scolari needed to stop dwelling on the success he had there and modernize his team. There were also some other very questionable picks in the squad too. Both Maicon and Maxwell were called up, and while both these guys used to be great players, they were far past their prime and should not have been in the squad. The players that Scolari overlooked and did not call up raises some eyebrows as well. Despite breaking the Barcelona-Real Madrid hegemony in Spain and winning La Liga before making to the Champions League final with Atletico Madrid, Miranda and Felipe Luis were left at home, despite being some of the best defenders in the world. Defense ended up being Brazil's weakest area of the pitch during the tournament, and one could only suspect that Miranda and Luis could have been put to great use if they were there. Another area that was lacking was the striker position. Ever since Adriano experienced personal problems and his form dipped, Brazil was lacking an elite striker. However, Scolari had the solution to that problem in the form of Diego Costa, who is one of the best strikers in the world at the moment. But for whatever reason, Scolari never trusted him and never truly gave him a chance. And faced with the desire to want to play at the World Cup, Costa switched his allegiance to Spain and then went on to represent the Spanish at the World Cup. Instead of Diego Costa, Scolari trusted in his two strikers, Fred and Joe. While I would not consider Fred a world-class player, he was amazing at the Confederations Cup, and he was top scorer of the Brazilian Serie A that year, as well as representing Brazil at the 2006 World Cup, 2007, and 2011 Copa America, and he was scoring goals for fun in the national team. True, the 2014 World Cup proved to be too large of a task. I still understand his place in the squad. Joe, on the other hand, who was a flop at Manchester City back in 2008 before the financial takeover, I do not. As good as he may have been in that one Copa Libertadores season, I still don't think it justifies his place in the squad over the alternate options. Other players who were left out were the gifted young players like Lucas Moura and Marquinhos. Even the Brazilian legends, Kaká and Ronaldinho, who admittedly were not in the best form, would have brought raw talent, class, and valuable experience to the squad. Upon the fact that Scolari did not even bring the best possible squad to the tournament, the issues were made even worse by Scolari's poor tactical decisions. For majority of the World Cup, several key players in the starting 11 played poorly, yet for the most part, Scolari was stubborn and continued to field them. One could argue that his options on the bench weren't much better, but that itself falls on Scolari's poor decision making too. As was mentioned before, Fred had a genuinely dreadful World Cup, but he continued to be the starting striker. Sure, Joe was no upgrade, but Scolari could have changed formation so that Hulk was the center forward, or Neymar was a false 9 in place of Fred. Speaking of Hulk, he was having a tough time out on the right wing, but instead of moving him to a different position or simply benching him for Willian, Hulk started almost every game. Dani Alves and Paulinho, players who were playing poorly and actually lost their starting spots, were replaced by Maicon and Fernandinho respectively, who played even worse. Scolari, not being able to find the perfect starting lineup as well as poor tactical decisions, were exposed heavily by Germany in the semifinals. Despite Germany being the best team in the competition thus far, Scolari opted to virtually play the same exact formation from earlier matches while having the youth player Bernard take Neymar's spot on the left wing. What Scolari should have done was bench Fred, then play Hulk as a center forward with Oscar directly underneath him and Willian and Hamidas on the flanks as deep-lying wingers, while Paulinho and Luis Gustavo sit at the base of midfield. This would have further protected Brazil's defense and given Germany a much harder time controlling the middle of the field. Instead, the Germans easily waltzed right through Brazil's midfield, just like a tank through a cornfield, while Bernard was completely man-marked out of the game by Philipp Lahm and Jerome Boateng. Another major issue with this Brazilian squad was the complete lack of experience as well. Only 6 of the 23 players in the squad had ever played at a World Cup before. Obviously, Scolari had no say here, as most of the Brazilians who played in previous World Cups had already retired, but at this point the responsibility was on him in order to mentally prepare these players for the tournaments, but instead the opposite occurred. Throughout the cup, it seemed that this crop of young players was cracking under the pressure, little by little, acting too emotional, crying at the national anthem, being too afraid to take penalties during shootouts, etc. And all it took was an experienced team like Germany to shatter it. This is partly the fault of the captain, Thiago Silva, but more so on, again, Luis Felipe Scolari. So overall, there are many reasons why Brazil was crushed under a German fist in Belo Horizonte, whether it be the absence of Neymar and Thiago Silva, a subpar generation of talents, an inexperienced squad under the pressure of an entire nation, or the poor tactical decisions of the coach. Open wounds were festering, and everything came to culmination on that infamous Tuesday evening. And while this video mostly focused on Brazil, this should take no credit away from Germany, who were virtually perfect top to bottom. This team was no doubt the deserved winners of the 2014 World Cup and one of the best teams in recent history. Germany in 2014 was an absolute machine. Unlike Brazil, funnily enough, they had an incredibly experienced squad, filled with world-class players in almost every position, creating a well-rounded team that did not need to rely on a superstar, led by a coach who fully understands his team and the best system to put in place.
Vem pra cá, deusa do amor.